Okay, hello kids. I hope everyone is staying safe and healthy through this kind of insane time. You've probably been hearing a lot about the coronavirus over the news, so I won't waste any more of your time with that. Let's just get into the lecture. Um, so today we're going to talk about developing through the lifespan. So we'll begin with parental development in the newborn, then we'll turn our attention to infancy and childhood, then adolescence, and then adulthood, and then finally death. Um, all right. Like this is everything that I already said. So we're going to talk about some developmental topics, issues, development, the newborn, go into infancy and the childhood, then adolescence, then adulthood, and then death. Okay, so developmental psychology examines our physical, cognitive, and social development across the lifespan with a focus on three major issues. So nature and nurture. So how is to what extent is our development influenced by our genes versus our experience, as well as the interaction between those two. Continuity and stages. So, what part of our development occurs gradually and continuous, and what changes occur abruptly, and which of our traits stay the same throughout our lifehood. So, which persist and which change as we get older. So we'll talk about, do adults differ from infants as a giant redwood differs from its seedling? So a difference created by gradual cumulative growth? Or do they differ as a butterfly differs from a caterpillar, a difference of distinct stages? It seems that although stage theory explains the development through childhood, adult life doesn't actually progress through this fixed, predictable series of stages. Chance events can influence us in ways which would have never predicted. Nevertheless, the stage concept remains useful. Stage theories contribute a developmental perspective on the whole lifespan by suggesting how people of one age think and act differently when they arrive at a later stage. And so, just to break down the stage a little bit, or this slide a little bit, what's being suggested, or what this slide is showing, is different stage theories proposed by different scientists. So we have Lawrence Kohlberg. We'll talk about their stages of development, stages of morality. Erik Erikson had the psychosocial stages of development, and then we'll also talk about Jean Piaget. And so developmental researchers who emphasize developmental researchers who emphasize learning and experience support continuity, but those who emphasize biological maturation tend to support stages. So let's start with prenatal development. The process of you started inside your grandmother as an egg formed inside a developing female inside of her. And so your mother was actually born with all the immature eggs she would ever have. Your father, in contrast, began producing sperm cells non-stop at puberty, in the beginning at a rate of more than 1,000 sperm a second. Then, sometime after puberty, your mother's ovary released a mature egg. Some 250 million deposited sperm began the race upstream, approaching a cell neither 85,000 times their own size. Okay, and the cell we're talking about is the eggs that your mother's ovary releases. So this is actually a really fortunate series of events because of 250 million sperm. the one needed to make you, in combination with that one particular egg, won the race. And so, if it wasn't for those innumerable generations before us, if any one of our ancestors had been conceived with a different sperm or egg, or died before conceiving, or had not met your mother, if this improbable, unbroken chain of events hadn't occurred, then it would not have produced us. All right. Then 10 days after conception, the zygote attaches to the mother's uterine wall, and the embryo forms. Okay, so the inner cells become the embryo and the outer cells become the placenta. And then at around 9 weeks until you are birthed, you are a fetus. And so during the next 6 weeks, body organs start to develop and function, and by 9 weeks, the fetus starts to actually look like a human. And so these are some interesting or high resolution pictures, and you can click on the link if you want for more photographs. A is an embryo of 40 months, B is at the end of 8 weeks, and C is at 4 months. So some of these pictures were taken with conventional cameras with macro lenses, while others were taken with the use of an endoscope. And so scanning electron microscope technology enables pictures at a magnification of hundreds of thousands, which enable us to get these pictures. So in addition to transferring nutrients and oxygens from mother to fetus, the placenta screens have many harmful substances, but some slip by. Even light drinking or occasional binge drinking can affect the fetal brain. So persistent drinking puts the fetus at a risk for birth defects and for future behavioral problems, hyperactivity, and lower intelligence. For 1 in about 800 infants, the effects are visible as fetal alcohol syndrome. And 60% of mental retardation is preventable by just not drinking during pregnancy. But so eventually you were born and equipped with certain tools that help us survive. So for example, we're born with these reflexes, if you will. So we have a sucking reflex. Whenever anything gets too close to the fetus's, the newborn's mouth, it'll put its mouth on it. Tonguing, swallowing, breathing. Babies cry in a very painful sounding way. And the evolutionary reason for this is that it signals that the baby needs help and comfort. We want to reduce the sound of that crying baby so much that, or the sound of the baby's crying sounds so awful that it causes us to care for the child. The newborn is able to search for sights and sounds that originate from other humans, especially its mother. The newborn can smell and see and use other sensory equipment to learn. And they also possess a temperament, which is biologically rooted. So, while early psychologists thought that newborns experienced blooming, buzzing, confusion, later scientists discovered that babies can actually tell you a lot if you know to ask. So to know how to ask a baby, you must capitalize on what babies can do. So they can gaze, suck, and turn their heads. So equipped with eye tracking machines and pacifiers wired to electronic gear, researchers set out to answer parents' age-old question: what can my baby see, hear, smell, and drink? So you can use habituation. So when fetuses, so they found that when you presented honking, vibrating devices to fetuses it would make movements, right? But eventually, the fetus stopped making those movements when they were presented after a while. So they found out that they were adapting, right? And so the novel stimulus gets attention when first presented, but with repetition, the response gets weaker. And so this seeming boredom with familiar stimuli gives us a way to ask infants what they see and remember, right? And so if we present a stimulus to a baby and they respond and they eventually respond less and less, then we know that they're able to experience the stimulus in the first place. Okay. Even as newborns, we prefer sights and sounds that facilitate social responsiveness. So we turn our heads in the direction of human voices. We gaze longer at a drawing of a face-like image. So, for example, what is being shown in the slide is that when babies are shown these same three elements, but babies will stare longer at the image that more resembles a face. And so even just in one study, they surveyed babies that had been born, that had been, out of the mother's womb for just 53 minutes. So even just 53 minutes in out of the mother's womb, you still have a preference to look at faces, which signals that perhaps this preference for faces is innate, that we're born with it. So nature and nurture together sculpt our synapses. So brain maturation provides us with a wealth of neural connections. In your mother's womb, your developing brain formed nerve cells at the explosive rate of nearly 250,000 per minute. And then the developing brain cortex actually overproduces neurons, with the number peaking at 28 weeks. So sights and smells, touches and tugs activate and strengthen some neural pathways, while others weaken from disuse. So if you guys were in class, I'd be asking you what your earliest memory is, how old you were, and most of you probably wouldn't remember anything that happened before 3 years of age. That's because our earliest conscious memory comes at about 3.5 years. And the inability to recall information before the age of 3 is called infantile amnesia. So, but what the conscious mind does not know and cannot express in words, the nervous system and our two-track mind somehow remember. So, for example, this baby or this infant may not or will not remember this mobile that is on top of them, but they will learn that kicking the mobile will move it. And this is something that they can retain for about a month. So they are capable of learning and remembering. It's just implicit learning. It's not something they consciously know. So they can remember non-conscious, so they can retain non-conscious information, like that kicking a mobile will move it, but they don't retain conscious information. For example, that if something horrible to them had happened, like falling out of bed in the middle of the night, they probably won't remember that. So the developing brain enables physical coordination. As an infant exercises its maturing muscles and nervous system, skills emerge. With occasional exceptions, the sequence of physical or motor development is pretty universal. So identical twins typically begin walking on nearly the same day. And this is guided by our genes and influenced by the environment. So maturation, including the rapid development of the cerebellum at the back of the brain, creates a readiness to learn walking at about age 1. The same is true for other physical skills, including bowel and bladder control. And before necessary muscular neural maturation, neither pleading nor punishment will produce successful toilet training. So, in the United States, about a quarter of us walk by 11 months, half of us walk by a year, and nearly all of us by 15 months. So, novice walkers, while they fall a lot, they're able to take a lot of steps and travel more and see more. Okay? So, that's pretty interesting. And then there's this back to sleep position. So, that's when you put babies to sleep on their back, and it actually is associated with later crawling, but not later walking. So they still begin to walk around the same time. So somewhere in our journey, we became conscious. When was that? Adult brave response signals conscious awareness about 300 milliseconds after an image appears. With more exposure time while looking at the faces, 5-month infants display the same brain signature of visual awareness. In line with this, Jean Piaget believed children were active thinkers, and his core idea was that our intellectual progression reflects an unceasing struggle to make sense of our experiences. So, schema, for instance, this is a mental framework that organizes and interprets information. So, assimilation is when we take new experiences and interpret them based on our existing schemas. And accommodation is when we adapt schemas to incorporate new ideas. So, for example, children have a schema for a dog, right? And so they see a dog and they say, oh, look, it's a dog. You know, they may see a cat and they say, oh, look, it's a dog, right? They might see a turtle and they might think dog, right? Because their schema for dog at first may not be very well developed. It might include any animal that has 4 legs. And so when they see a cat, they assimilate the cat based on their schema of a dog. And they see, oh, it has 4 legs, so it must be dog. But eventually we accommodate the schemas to incorporate new information, right? Eventually we learn that a cat is not the same as a dog. So now we have a cat schema, and it's different from the dog schema, right? The dog schema becomes updated to include more information that helps differentiate the dog from the cat. And so we're going to talk about Piaget now a little bit. So Piaget's view, cognitive development, so all of the mental activities associated with thinking, knowing, remembering, communicating, consisted of 4 major stages: the sensory motor, the pre-operational, concrete operational, and formal operational. Oh yeah, and this kind of helps me explain what a schema is. So if you look at this and then you turn away and I ask you to draw the image that you saw, it would be really difficult because we don't have a schema for an image like this. Stare at it long enough and you'll see that this tuning fork is an impossible object. It doesn't make sense. And so we don't have any schema for such an image, so staring at it just continues to confuse us. We're not able to assimilate it into an existing schema. So getting back to Jean Piaget, a number of behaviors characterize the sensory motor stage. So very young babies seem to live in the present. Out of sight, out of mind. In one test, Piaget showed an infant an appealing toy and then flopped his beret over it. Before the age of 6, the infant acted as if the toy ceased to exist. That's because they lack object permanence. They think that it disappears, right? And so by 8 months, infants begin exhibiting memory for things that they no longer see. And this is why peekaboo is so entertaining for babies. Because when you mask the object, the baby actually thinks that it has disappeared. And so researchers also believe that Piaget and his followers underestimated young children's competence. Preschoolers can't actually think like little scientists. They test ideas, make causal inferences, and learn from statistical patterns. Baby physics is an example of this. Infants look longer at an unexpected and unfamiliar scene of a car seeming to pass through a solid object, a ball stopping in midair, or an object violating object permanence by magically disappearing, right? And there's also this term called baby math. So infants would sometimes do a double take, staring longer when shown a wrong number of objects. But children also make these silly scale errors. So at around, at around 18 to 30 months, babies may not be able to take the size of an object into account when trying to perform impossible actions. So on the left, you see a 21-month-old is attempting to slide down a miniature slide. Kind of dumb, if you ask me. And at the right, the 24-month-old opens the door to a miniature car and starts to step inside. So, not looking pretty dumb, but it's okay. I've tried to do this too. At not at 18 to 30 months, but at 25 years of age. So whoops. Okay. Moving on. The pre-operational stage, which happens at about 2 to 7 years. Children learn to use language, but cannot yet perform the mental operations of concrete logic. And they also struggle with the idea of conservation, which we'll see in an upcoming slide. They also demonstrate high levels of egocentrism, so difficulty perceiving things from another person's point of view. So you ask a baby, do you have a brother? They say yes. What's his name? Jim. Does Jim have a brother? And they say no. Okay. Because they struggle taking the perspective of another person. Or this other thing that babies mistake often is thinking that someone can't see you because you can't see them. And this is called the curse of knowledge. Okay, so children in this stage also begin to develop what we call a theory of mind. So this involves the ability to read the mental states of others. Between around 3.5 and 4.5, children use theory of mind to realize that people might have false beliefs. But by 4 to 5, children are able to anticipate the false beliefs of friends. So when I say false beliefs, there's an example of this is this experiment where they showed Toronto children a Band-Aid box and asked them what was inside. Expecting Band-Aids, the children were surprised to discover that the box actually contained pencils. And when they asked what a child who had never seen the box would think was inside, the 3-year-old typically answered pencils, right? They weren't able to read the false beliefs that another person would have. But by age 4 to 5, the children's theory of mind actually leaps forward, and they were anticipate their friend's false belief that the pencil would hold Band-Aids. There's also the Sally and Ann task. You have a child watch this scene with Sally and Anne. Sally puts her ball into a red cupboard and then goes away. And then Anne comes and moves the ball to the blue cupboard. So if Sally comes back and we would know that Sally would check the red box for the ball, because Sally wasn't there when Anne moved the ball to the blue cupboard. But for children who haven't yet developed a theory of mind, they would predict that Sally would choose the blue cupboard, because they're not able to understand that Sally has a false belief. And so this is what I was talking about when I said conservation. It's another hallmark of the pre-operational stage. And so this child still doesn't understand the principle of conservation. So when the milk he has 2 glasses of milk in front of her. It's obviously the same amount of milk. One of the glasses gets poured into a tall and narrow glass, and the baby or the child thinks that the narrow glass has more liquid in it only because it's taller than the other glass, even though she watched the person pour the glass of milk in front of her, right? In another year or so, she'll understand that the amount stays the same even though it looks different. Oh, right. Children then pass through the concrete operational stage, in which they're given concrete or physical materials, and they begin to grasp conservation. Understanding that change in form does not mean change in quantity. They can mentally pour milk back and forth between glasses of different shapes. They then pass through the formal operational stage from age 12 through adulthood. And so at this point, children no longer are limited to concrete reasoning based on actual experience, and they are able to begin thinking abstractly. So these are Piaget's stages of cognitive development for you to look through. Sorry, I just got a text message in. I want to see what it says. Just give me a second. Make sure no one's mad at me. Okay. Yep, people are definitely mad at me, but I'm going to continue as if they're not. Okay. So we also have an alternative viewpoint. Vygotsky was actually born the same year as Piaget and was very intelligent, but died early from tuberculosis. And while Piaget emphasized how the child's mind goes through interacting with the physical environment, Vygotsky emphasized how the child's mind goes through interacting with the social environment. So whether out loud or inaudibly, talking to themselves helps children control their behavior and emotions and master new skills. And so where Piaget was right and where he was wrong. So he was able to identify significant cognitive milestones and did stimulate a global interest in cognitive development. And research findings do suggest that the sequence of these cognitive milestones occur basically as Piaget predicted they would. But we've also seen that development is actually more continuous than Piaget theorized. They don't happen at these concrete stages. And Piaget often underestimated how competent children were. And so it's useful to remember as parents or teachers that young children are incapable of adult logic. and that children are not passive but active learners. Child cognition flourishes when adults build on what children know and engage them in concrete demonstrations and stimulate creative thinking. And children's cognitive immaturity is, in a way, adaptive. So you can think of it as nature's strategy for keeping children close to protective adults and providing time for learning and socialization. Related to cognitive development in the theory of mind is autism spectrum disorder. So, autism spectrum disorder has differing levels of severity. And in general, reading faces and social signals is challenging for those with autism spectral disorder. And the underlying cause is attributed to a lack of communication between areas of the brain that are important for theory of mind, as well as genetic influences. And so from age 2 months on, children who develop autism spectrum disorder spend less and less time looking into each other's eyes compared to others. And they have this impaired theory of mind, so this struggle to read intentions and expressions. So, autism spectrum disorder was once believed to affect 1 in 2,500 children and was referred to simply as autism. But now it gets diagnosed in about 1 in 68 Americans at age 8. But this diagnosis prevalence varies by place. So New Jersey has a 4 times higher chance than Alabama of a child developing ASD. In Great Britain, it's about 1 in 100, and South Korea is about 1 in 38. And the increase in autism spectrum diagnosis has been offset by a decrease in the number of children diagnosed with a cognitive disability or a quote-unquote learning disability, which suggests that it might not be that more people are developing autism spectrum disorder. It might be that we're relabeling other disorders as autism spectrum disorder. So autism spectrum disorder tends to be higher among elite math students and children of engineers and MIT graduates. It's also higher when your identical twin has autism spectrum disorder, and having a younger sibling heightens risk. And just one really important thing for you to know, vaccines do not influence the prevalence of autism spectrum disorder. If we were in class, I'd probably go on a huge rant about that, but we're not in class. So, by the way, I hope that you're all happy and you're all doing well. And I know this is a tough time, but I hope everyone gets through it safely. Okay, so from birth, babies are social creatures. They develop an intense bond with their caregivers. Infants come to prefer familiar faces and voices. They coo and gurgle when given a parent's attention. They also experience stranger anxiety. So this is a fear of strangers that infants commonly display. Children at this age have schemas for familiar faces, and when they cannot assimilate the new face into these remembered schemas, they become distressed. And for many years, psychologists reasoned that infants became attached to those to satisfy their need for nourishment, but an accidental finding overturned this explanation. So what overturned this explanation was this experiment that Harry Harlow did. So Harry Harlow and Margaret Harlow bred monkeys for their learning studies. And so to equalize experiences and to isolate any disease, they separated the infant monkeys from their mothers shortly after birth. And they raised the monkeys in individual cages, which included this cheesecloth baby blanket on the monkey. And they found that when their soft blankets were taken to be laundered, the monkeys became really distressed. they started to sense that the monkeys really actually enjoyed something about this soft blanket that was attached to what they thought was their mother. And so, to pit the drawing power of a food source against the contact comfort of the blanket, they created two artificial mothers. One was a bare wire cylinder with a wooden head and an attached feeding bottle, and the other was a cylinder wrapped with terry cloth. And basically, babies chose the contact with the terry cloth mother, so the comfortable mother, even though the wire mother, the mother that didn't have the cloth, provided nourishment. So they were choosing comfort over food. So contact is one key to attachment, but we also have familiarity. In many animals, attachments based on familiarities form during a critical period. For goslings, ducklings, or chicks, that period falls in the hours shortly after hatching, when the first moving thing they see is their mother. And so Conrad Lorenz wondered what would happen if he was the first thing they saw. And he found that they started following him around. Human children actually do not imprint, but are attached more to what they've known. So they watch the same movies, they read the same books. If you guys were in class, I'd be asking you, what are the same movies that you guys watched when you were kids? But we're not. Okay, so hardship short of trauma often boosts mental toughness. But without a sharp break from an abusive past, children do not readily recover. And I ask you to watch that YouTube video on the slide when you're at home. I can't really play it from here on my laptop. It would create a huge disturbance when trying to record my lecture. And related to this, in the 1970s and 1980s, Romania's communist dictator outlawed contraception, forbade abortion, and taxed families with fewer than 5 children. What happened is the birth rate skyrocketed, but unable to afford the children they had been coerced into having, many families abandoned them to government-run orphanages with untrained, overworked staff. And what they found is that when children were eventually tested after the dictator was assassinated, those children had lower intelligence and double the rate of anxiety symptoms found in children assigned to better foster care settings. It's crazy. So infancy's major social achievement is attachment. Childhood's major social achievement is a positive sense of self. By about age 12, most children have developed a self-concept. So a self-concept is an understanding and evaluation of who we are, and it emerges gradually. Self-awareness begins at 6 months when children can pass the mirror test. So put a color on a child's nose and then place them in front of a mirror. At 6 months, the child would reach out to the mirror as if it were another child. However, by 15 months, they will touch their own nose since they have now developed a schema for their face and they wonder, what is that dot doing on my face? So, moving on to parenting styles. Some parents spank, some reason, some restrict, some relax. Some show little affection, some liberally hug and kiss. Do such differences in parenting styles affect children? And so researchers have developed 3 main parenting styles. Authoritative parents are confrontive. They are demanding and responsive. They exert control by setting rules, but especially with older children, they encourage open discussion and allow exceptions. Permissive parents are unrestraining. They make few demands and use little punishment. They may be indifferent, unresponsive, or unwilling to set limits. Authoritarian parents are coercive. They impose rules and expect obedience. They say, don't interrupt, keep your room clean, stay out late or you'll be grounded. Why? Because I said so. So that was like my parents. And so it seems that authoritative parenting seems to have children that develop in the most healthy way. They have the highest self-esteem, self-reliance, and social competence. But this association between certain parenting styles and certain childhood outcomes is correlational. It could be that the child being socially competent elicits a certain parenting style rather than the other way around. But also a reminder about culture. So values vary from place to place, and they tend to influence parenting styles. And children seem to survive and flourish under many different child rearing systems and many different cultures. So this diversity in child rearing should remind us that no single culture has the only way to raise children successfully. Okay, so adolescence starts with the physical beginnings of sexual maturity and ends with the social achievement of independent adult status. Similar to what we found with earlier life stages, the sequence is quite predictable, but the timing is not. It is not only when we mature that counts, but how people react to our physical development. So early maturing boys are generally more popular, self-assured, independent, but they're also more at risk for risky behaviors like alcohol use, delinquency, sexual activity. Early maturing girls, on the other hand, have this mismatch between how they look physically and feel emotionally. And so this may encourage them to search for older teens, and teasing or, unfortunately, sexual harassment may occur. The frontal lobe development and synaptic pruning the frontal lobe development that's occurring, as well as synaptic pruning, may produce irrational and risky behaviors. So, if you guys were in class, I'd be asking you what characterizes your teenage years. In general, between this biological maturity and social dependence creates this period of storm and stress. So, indeed, after age 30, many who grew up in independence fostering Western cultures look back on their teenage years as a time they would not want to relive, a time when their parents' social approval was imperative. Their sense of direction in life was in flux, and their feelings of alienation from their parents was deepest. But for many, adolescence is a time of vitality without the cares of adulthood, a time of rewarding friendships, heightened idealism, and a growing sense of life's exciting possibilities. So, if you guys were in class, we'd be having this exciting, lengthy discussion about should there be a death penalty? And the whole point of this slide is to show you that there is this age where impulse control is the hardest and sensation seeking is the highest, which occurs at around 16 to 17 years, which is why in 2005, by 5-4 margin, the Supreme Court declared that death penalties for juveniles is unconstitutional. So, during early teen years, reasoning is often self-focused. Adolescents may think that their private experiences are unique, something parents just could not understand. But mom, you don't really know how it feels to be in love. Capable about their own thinking and other people's thinking, they also begin imagining what others are thinking about them. And so Lawrence Kohlberg proposed a stage theory of moral reasoning from a pre-conventional morality of self-interest to a conventional morality concerned with upholding laws and social rules to, and some people, post-conventional morality of universal ethical principles. And so this is a summary of Kohlberg's levels of moral thinking. We won't go into it too deep, but it's there for you to look over if you'd like. So, Haidt talked about this concept of moral intuitions. So, quick gut feelings or affectively laden intuitions. So, consider the desire to punish. Laboratory games reveal that the desire to punish wrongdoings is mostly driven not by reason, such as an objective calculation that punishment deters crime, but rather by emotional reactions, such as moral outrage. Yet, morality is more than just thinking that something is right or wrong. Morality involves actually doing the right thing. And so, there's this video on this slide that you guys should really watch. It's called the Marshmallow Experiment. And I promise you'll enjoy it. So, theorist Erik Erikson contended that each stage of life has its own psychosocial task, a crisis that needs resolution. So, young children wrestle with issues of trust, then autonomy, which means independence, then initiative. School-age children strive for competence, feeling able and productive. And you can think of the adolescent's task as to synthesize the past, present, and future possibilities. Oh, sorry. I'm having a yawn attack. Jesus. So the adolescent's task is to synthesize past, present, and future possibilities into a clearer sense of self. So adolescents wonder, who am I as an individual? What do I want to do with my life? What values should I live by? What do I believe? Erik Erikson called this quest the adolescent's search for identity. And so adolescents wonder, who am I as an individual? What do I... Sorry, I was just re-saying something that I already said. And so because I'm just having a yawning attack. And so basically their task is to solidify a sense of self by testing and blending various roles. Okay, so to refine their sense of identity, adolescents in individualist cultures usually try out different selves in different situations. They may act out one self at home and another with friends, and still another at school or online. So, again, if you guys were here, I'd be asking you, what is your, it's not a phase, mom or dad, phase. And so this interesting question you ask people, you ask them, which of these statements best describes you? I would change my life the way it is right now, or I wish I was somebody else. And interestingly, we find that 81% of people choose the statement that they would choose their life the way it is right now. And so most young people tend to develop a contentment with their lives. I wonder if people listening to this right now are yawning because I've been yawning so much. Please let me know if my yawning caused you to yawn. Send me an email. Okay, so another yawn. People seek to fit in and are also influenced by their groups, especially during childhood and teen years. And so, but this influence of parents and peers is complementary. So, um, parent-child arguments increase, but most adolescents do report liking their parents, and uh, argument content is usually often gender related. Peers also influence behavior. Social networking is often extensive, and exclusion from groups of friends can be painful or even worse. And conflict during this transition to adolescence tends to be greater with firstborn than secondborn children, and greater with mothers than with fathers. And if you guys were here, I'd ask you, what do you think some of these gender-related arguments would be? But you guys aren't here, so I'll tell you that with sons, the issues often are behavior problems, such as acting out or hygiene, while for daughters, the issues commonly involve relationships, such as who they're allowed to date and who their friends are allowed to be. And so we see these influence of parents and also peers is very similar to our findings from nature versus nurture chapter. Okay, what happens next? So what happens next is this period of time called emerging adulthood. So this is the period of time from age 18 to the mid-20s, when you're not really settled yet. So perhaps you graduated from college and you haven't found a job yet. You're living with your parents, and so you have these feelings of being in between, and they. Many people in this stage of time are still, emotionally dependent on their parents, and is found often in today's Western cultures. And so, at earlier times and in other parts of the world today, this slice of life was usually a much smaller period of time, which I'll show you on another slide. Shortly after sexual maturity, young people would assume adult responsibilities and status. And this event might be celebrated with an elaborate initiation or a public rite of passage. And then the new adult would then work, marry, and have children. And so, if you guys are here, I'd ask you, what reason can you think of for this period being shortened over time? And compulsory schooling is one reason. Another reason is that women are now more able to have lives that are independent of their spouse. So decide to start families until after they have gone through educated and starting a career. And another reason for this is that, basically, early sexual maturity and later independence has widened this gap over the years. So, for example, you see that in 1890, emerging adulthood was much shorter. Menarche occurred later, and marriage occurred earlier. But now menarche occurs earlier and marriage occurs later. Man, people were getting married really early back then. They're getting married at 21, 22. Man, 50% of men have met these 5 milestones. That's really interesting. If you guys were here, I'd ask you, what age range would you put in each blank? So you guys would probably give ridiculous answers. So for example, early adulthood is usually around the 20s and 30s, while middle adulthood actually can go from that to all the way to age 65, whereas late adulthood are the years after age 65. But remember, though, that within each of these stages, people vary widely in physical, psychological, and social development. And the image I have here is this guy, George Blair. He's 93 years old, and he maintained his place in the record books as the world's oldest barefoot water skier. But he actually died 7 years ago in 2013. All right, early adulthood. Um, we peak in a lot of areas in the mid 20s, and in middle adulthood, physical vigor is more closely linked to health um, than age. Or I'm sorry, more linked to exercise than age is. You start physically declining. It is gradual, and you gradually start declining in fertility. And while females experience menopause, men gradually decline in sperm count, testosterone level, erections, and ejaculation speed. And so for 30 to 39-year-old woman, the chance of getting pregnant after single act of intercourse is only half that as a woman 19 to 26. Sexual activity lessens, but men and women still remain capable of satisfying sexual activity, and most express satisfaction with their sex life. So, late adulthood, life expectancy is increased drastically from 46 and a half to 70. A lot of these physical skills start declining, like a lot of those related to vision. The immune system weakens. We become more susceptible to diseases like the coronavirus. Neural processing lag occurs, so the brain regions related to memory begin to atrophy and speech slows. Exercise, though, can slow aging and does stimulate brain cell developments and neural connections. So in terms of memory, early adulthood is a peak time for some learning and memory. And while our ability to recall declines in middle adulthood, our ability to recognize information stays mostly steady. And in late adulthood, is characterized by better retention of meaningful to meaningless words. So we're becoming more efficient. So our memory's getting worse, but in areas in which we need to stay efficient, we do stay efficient. Okay. So I'm not going to show this. This is basically what I said about recognition versus recall. Okay, so most people who live into their 90s do so with clear minds. However, some, unfortunately, do suffer a substantial loss of brain cells in a process that's not normal to aging. So, for example, neurocognitive disorders are acquired disorders, not lifelong disorders that are coincide with cognitive deficits. They're related to Alzheimer's disease, brain injury, or substance abuse, and they often result in erosion of mental abilities that doesn't typically occur with normal aging. Alzheimer's disease, another disease you've probably heard of, marked by neural plaques, and usually onset after age 80, and also entails a progressive decline in memory and other cognitive abilities. Alzheimer's, talking more about that, as the disease runs its course, after 5 to 20 years, the person becomes emotionally flat, then disoriented and dissipated, then incontinent, and finally mentally vacate, a sort of living death, a mere body stripped of its humanity. And so also incurs a loss of brain cells, deterioration of neurons that produce acetylcholine, protein fragments accumulate as plaque, and the critical brain cells and activity in critical areas of the brain lessen and degenerate in areas of the brain related to Alzheimer's occurring. And you can actually, during an MRI test, see people who are more at risk for Alzheimer's disease. They have more intense activity So the yellow, orange, and red when compared with normal brains. So I would ask you, um, as brain scans and genetic tests make it possible to identify those likely to suffer Alzheimer's, would you want to be tested, and at what age? And I would be really interested to hear what you guys have to say, but fortunately we can't do that. So what is your stereotype for this midlife transition? Unhappiness, job dissatisfaction, marital dissatisfaction, divorce anxiety, and suicide, many of you might say, but these actually do not surge during the early 40s. So divorce, for example, is most common among those in their 20s, and suicide among those in their 70s and 80s. So let's talk about commitment in adulthood. We typically flirt, fall in love, and commit one person at a time. And so, from an evolutionary perspective, this does seem to make sense. So, relatively monogamous pairing makes sense. Parents who cooperate to nurture their children to maturity were more likely to have their genes passed along to posterity than were parents who didn't. And so, if you guys were here, I'd ask you, do you believe in soulmates? Typically we find, or historically we find, that couples meet at school, on the job, through family, especially through friends. But since the advent of the internet, such matchmaking has been supplemented by a striking rise in couples who meet online. So, are you meeting these people because they're soulmates, or are you meeting them because you run into them more often than other people? Or is it both? Okay, so what is marriage? What should marriage be? What are your opinions on cohabitation before marriage? These are questions that I'd be asking you if you guys were here, and we could talk a little bit more about this slide. Otherwise, I won't spend too much more time on this. Next slide. For many adults, the answer to "who are you" depends a great deal on the answer to "what do you do?" For women and men, choosing a career path is difficult, especially during bad economic times. Especially in the best of times, for few students in their first years of college, university can predict their later careers. And finally, we get to death and dying. Grief is often very severe when a loved one dies suddenly, before we expect them to. And strong expressions of emotion often do not purge grief, and the bereavement therapy is not significantly more effective than grieving without such aid. And Erik Erikson, viewed the late adulthood psychosocial task as developing a sense of integrity versus despair. And so if you guys are here, I'd ask you if you believe in assisted suicide. And more on this topic is the idea that, or the fact that, facing death with dignity and openness can help people complete the life cycle with a sense of life's meaningfulness and unity, the sense that their existence has been good and that life and death are parts of an ongoing cycle. So although death may be unwelcome, life itself can be affirmed even in death. And that is the end of the chapter. I'm sorry for posting this late. I hope that everyone is doing well. I will post a updated syllabus and give out more information about those quizzes I said about. If you have done whatever Sona credits you have already done, just to answer a lot of your questions, can replace the quizzes. So if you've done 7 credits of Sona, you do not have to do any more quizzes. If you would like to get 5% extra credit, then you can do that, but only up to 5 points. And if you've done 12 Sona credits already, then you're good. You'll get the 7 quiz credits, and you'll also get 5% extra tacked onto your grade. And so, okay, guys, I hope you guys enjoyed this lecture, and I'll see you next week.